Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Guardians of the Galaxy. Reasonably, I want to say that some details about this review there may not be a ton of details because this movie is so complex. I think that's why I feared so much talking about it. I feared so much getting into it and reviewing it because I'm like, oh man, I'm very concerned about how complex this movie was. Even so much more so than you could say well, what about Avengers movies? Um what about this and that? Endgame was 3 hours. I get that, but I think still none of those movies are as complex as this movie is. Basically, you have to tell so many stories and have you invest in all these people. Ultimately, I had probably said honestly that Guardians of the Galaxy, or just Guardians, probably are not legitimately my favorite team, only because really when looking at it, these characters are so well done and so you could do a movie and or series individually of them and people will completely buy onto that. Hence why you have them in Endgame where they are at points separated up, because again, they are amazing as a whole, but when looking at it, they're also amazing separated. Going into this movie, bravo to James Gunn, because when looking at this, he has made a movie much more complex than Star Wars. And for me, Star Wars is hard to always review because it feels like there's so much detail going on in it. There's so much, it feels like you need to know every name of every creature, of every background, of every whatever, and ultimately I probably won't be able to do that here. I just probably won't. To simply have actors like Glenn Close in this movie, I'm like, oh my god, she's won awards over and over and over. And you could say it's well, she plays a small part in this, but still, to see the roster of not only of the Guardians, but of a lot of people that went to go on even bigger things, or even just overall just fascinating characters just besides this one. You have Lee Pace, who ultimately is Ronan in this, and God, he is such a fun villain. For how he mentions about the tender that you will burn, that is the best part of this movie. I think to me it's always memorable, and that's always the point that I would shout out at any point within remembering this movie. You you have it to where I say that these characters feel within this movie quasi separate at times, because ultimately when they're all getting their mugshots, they're individually getting their mugshots. Yeah, in the poster of this, they're all stacked side by side together, but once they're all getting their mugshots, of course they are all separated. Stuff about this says, yeah, this is a 100% team, but when looking at it, I still want to see that I still want to see that full-fledged moment where they're all like a real a real team, even though they are still, it's like, to me, I need time. I need to see that they're much more than pirates, and I still haven't got to see that yet. Or in, I guess, uh, Chris Pratt's mentioning like losers, I guess, which when looking at them, when looking at these characters, they're always underdogs, and we have Peter Quill that is kind of almost like, he's almost Chris Evans. He's almost Captain America. He's a man plucked from time. He's a man plucked from time because he only knows a certain period. Because him being on Terror, aka Earth, we have Peter, who is a man out of time that is placed into a world that he had to become accustomed to. And that is the thing. Like, I could spend hours and hours talking about this and just like really pulling it all apart. We have Zoe, who plays Gamora, who, when like watching this and remembering this, I'm like, it's so weird to see that Gamora's hair was basically like completely like black, and then in the later movies like the colors changed. It was interesting to see that, like, color palettes of some characters. It was interesting to see characters look so young, especially you have Karen Gillian, who plays Nebula, that she like really like she really just kind of plays like a minion to Lee, to Ronan. But then luckily I'm so happy that in like the sequel she gets more time. Gamora gets more time. Especially when going into the further along movies. When especially when you get like Endgame, like Nebula is like the linchpin of that story. Gamora is a character from out of time. Like, so it's kind of interesting to see that basically at some point becomes Chris. Like, and I know people could say it's like, how is Chris, how is Chris's character a man out of time? Like, it's just the point of like huge gaps of technology that eventually, over years, over time, he's eventually going to learn. And that is the thing that I enjoyed about this. This is like, there are so many things going on within this story, and you have the setup of Michael Rooker's character, who is Yondu, that like there are some interesting things going on with this character, but I think he gets even more flushed out within Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Like, I think he is just kind of put in here as a quasi mentor to Peter's character, or Star Lord. And Star Lord throughout this movie is eventually realizing that that whatever he does, like how much he accomplishes, like it's gonna take him such a long time to for anyone to eventually like respect him or like know that he even exists, which that is the thing that eventually I love is for eventually for especially the Nova Corps to ultimately trust him and ultimately fight alongside him. That is the interesting part about this movie, and again, taking a very long time talking about it, um, which is only 10 because this cryptic like version of this movie is probably going to take a long period of time. So we have some interesting things that I've learned even behind the scenes where you saw or you would get to see that Sean Gunn, who's uh, James Gunn's brother, ultimately who had been in a number of James Gunn movies. And ultimately I believe James Gunn himself was kind of like plopped into the background as well as any number of people that you didn't know. I think Stan Lee was in the background of one scene as a character, I believe. We have Sean Gunn in this movie who I know or I had seen from behind the scenes. He had done the the stuff whenever they would do Groot or the stuff whenever they would do Rocket. They would consistently like just have Sean do all those. So good for him. I hope that he um, like it was great to ultimately see that when it was Guardians Galaxy Volume 2, like it seems that really Sean in the sequel had a much more role, which I was happy about when seeing this. So we have Del Toro, Benicio del Toro, who plays the Collector. Here's where the complexity of this is, and here's where I'm just like godsmacked about just like, I'm gonna be reviewing this. Because yeah, the Collector has so many Easter eggs just wrapped around this whole room, and like references to the Dark World, references to, of course, the Marvel character Howard the Duck that was supposed to be getting a series with Kevin Smith that ultimately, sadly, just didn't sadly go anywhere, and I wish it did because that would have been interesting to see where that was heading. Um, because I know Kevin Smith talked about it. We we have it to where this CG in this movie completely feels flawless. Everything about if there was a difference between CG and like, because you could kind of point out, it's like, well, what about the scene where Groot is like ripping through people and then smashing them back and forth, and then he like looks at the cameras like like people could say, but when looking at this, like Rocket, when you look at Rocket consistently throughout this entire movie, flawless. Uh, when going and looking in Groot through a bulk of this movie, he fits in everywhere. Like it doesn't feel like he ever sticks out. There is so much amazing things visually going on that it's just consistent eye candy, consistent Easter eggs, and also throwing back to a past which a lot of people love the nostalgia of. Of course, the beginning of this movie takes place in 1988, where ultimately we have it to where Peter is going through some struggle, ultimately to be in a very much old fashioned, sucked up by ET, or what we would normally think is a extraterrestrial X Files like approach. Uh, uh, and this and that. So I was trying to come up with the Richard Dreyfuss movie, the Third Kind film. I want to try to think of that name, but ultimately yeah. But when looking at it, like I don't remember the full name. Um, and more than likely, that's not exactly what happens in that film. But like I'm trying to make an alien adjacent movie, but there's probably more abduction kind of films that I'm probably forgetting. Maybe like uh, there was a Stephen King film where ultimately someone had gotten abducted, and then like the rest of the movies, I think them trying to handle it. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. Believe me, it was a while ago. I didn't research all of those movies because there's some deep. Anyways, so I think that's all I want to go into for the heavy details because there's a lot to still comb over and still come into and still bring up. So let's go into also letting everybody know if you have Disney Plus, you can easily watch this movie or eventually find a copy on like a reasonable retailer or Amazon or something like that. Ultimately, you can probably see uh, a Dave Bautista movie that is also being put on Amazon. Uh, uh, it's a spy film. I know I've reviewed it. So, going into this, we are gonna go into spoilers about this movie because yeah, it's gonna take a while. Like this movie is like an hour and some change, and it's probably gonna be one of those where I'm gonna have to go into detail about. So spoiler time. It's about the time I'm gonna do spoil this movie. So in the very beginning of this film, we have Chris Pratt as a younger person. We have Peter Quill as a younger person. And we ultimately have him just kind of listening to headphones, ultimately at a hospital, knowing full well that uh, this is probably going to be the last time that he is going to be on this planet. He doesn't know that, but we know that. Because, especially if we've seen this before. We have Peter eventually go to a sick mother and ultimately realizing that this is probably going to be his last time seeing her, or maybe not, because ultimately in his mind he can always come back and find her again. So we have Peter holding on to his mother, and his mother is telling him about the gift that he's going to give him, which of course he will unwrap by the end of this movie. And we also have her tell him that like a little bit about his father, which we won't get into in this film, but the sequel will. She'll mention that his father was a star, and so reasonably, like, it gets to the point where one, of course, family member mentions, it's like, well, hey, how, like, isn't there something you're going to give him? Gives him the gift, and then ultimately his mother gets too sick and ultimately collapses, pushing Peter out of the hospital room, and in a very emotional state because he's realizing what is happening. He realizes he's going to possibly lose the closest thing to him that he has ever loved. So ultimately, Peter realizing that he's going to lose his mother pushes him to just want to run away. Run away from the hospital. And surefire enough, while running out of this hospital, he gets sucked up into a Ravager ship that ultimately we only get to see that he's just sucked up into this ship, ultimately to be showcased years later, him being a much older Peter Quill. The very much interesting dance sequence that Peter goes into, because I'll kind of get through a lot of the introduction things of this and this and that. Like, we have Peter kind of going through his life and dancing his way up to what he does not know is an Infinity Stone. So we have him dancing. We have him having a good time, realizing there's another bit of this, there's another cut of this that we aren't aware of because ultimately Avengers Endgame. So we have Peter dancing his way to this Infinity Stone, ultimately having this moment being very much like an Indiana Jones, like Temple of Doom kind of moment, where Peter can't just go ahead and just grab this thing. He has to figure out this trap to ultimately get this stone out. Ultimately to be thwarted by Ronan's minions, ultimately having Djimon, who plays Korath, who, of course, I know Djimon from Never Back Down. We're we have it to where Djimon, or Korath, who ultimately I believe is also in Captain Marvel, because there's a tying into this movie with Captain Marvel. So we have it to where Korath is wanting, of course, the Infinity Stone as much as Peter is, and basically Peter is like kind of trying to act dumb or trying to reasonably end up just kind of getting annoyed with some Ninja Turtles, which aren't actually Ninja Turtles, but he calls them that, because these are very Shellish-like characters. And ultimately we have it to where, like, there is consistent tossing out of references that I think at some point, like, Chris Pratt has, where I think it probably matches for the time period that he was in, but I'm not quite sure if it like matches like the things that he like goes into at certain points, like saying that an outlaw is like John Stamos. I'm like, okay, how did that fit exactly? Like, did like is John Stamos just a character that like he just doesn't like? I don't know. Maybe John Stamos was just a character that, or an actor that was heavily popular during that time period. Because any number of things that John Stamos has ever done, I think probably maybe uh, Full House and all kinds of. Anyways, mood point. We have in this movie, we have Peter who outsmarts Karath and the Ronin minions, and eventually forwards off to eventually go on to his ship. We also have Ronin kind of waking up, seemingly, putting on war paint, uh, putting on his gigantic samurai Esh-like costume that I'm sure weighed a ton, or who knows, probably did. It probably weighed like a crap. So, because how thick that thing is. So we have Peter, who eventually is flying off to, not even knowing like the stowaway that he had, a woman that he ultimately had slept with and didn't even realize was on the ship until it was too late. Because the girl's like, Peter, what's going on? And he's like, I didn't even realize you were here. I'm sorry. Funny enough, the name of the ship is the Milano, which ultimately was, of course, Alyssa Milano, which of course was a character on Who's the Boss, which I guess was again a reference to Peter's period of time. Evidently, uh, Peter had a fascination with Alyssa Milano. So we have into here where Peter is of knowing full well about the Infinity Stone and the value it possesses, but like he knows that this thing is very valuable, but he doesn't know why. Like he doesn't know the actual ins and outs of it, because plenty enough times he was playing around with it. He was tossing it around. He would drop it. He like he didn't realize like how actually valuable this is until they finally showcase how valuable it is. And then it's like, dude, you had that thing in your satchel? And he's like, or in your purse? He's like, it's a satchel. So we have Peter's girl who was with him on the ship that accidentally answers a phone call that, of course, is Michael Rooker's character Yondu, mentioning how, hey, I'm here on this planet, but the orb isn't here. Where are you? Because Peter is wanting to very much disconnect himself from Yondu, because ultimately all the times that Peter, the conflict between these characters and how Yondu ultimately is consistently mentioning to him repetitively how every single time like he sees him, it's like, hey, you know what, you know my Ravengers, they wanted to eat you. They've never tasted Terran before. every time in this movie. And then it's kind of funny the quip back in the second half of this film. So it'd be interesting to know how many times that Michael Rooker's character uh Yondu would have said this to probably Peter. It would have been interesting if they would have like, yeah, it's like you've told this to me like millions of times, millions, because I'm sure he has. So we have to where ultimately Peter is going to Nova Corps to they're going to Nova to the planet where all the Nova Corps are, and he is going to see how valuable this actually is. And here's where we have uh, some interesting aspects because Yondu's character has put a bounty on Peter's character, and ultimately there's a lot of people that are quick. Now I mean quick to catch up to him and collect for his bounty. Ultimately, we have it to where Rocket is scoping around to ultimately see any number of people like Stan Lee, who is ultimately, yeah, he's just a normal, it seems to be a regular human, but funny enough, like he's from this planet. We ultimately have like a little baby that, like, Rocket is like, oh my god, little baby. It's not cool to be helped, baby. So we have Rocket Raccoon, who is kind of mentioning all this. We have eventually to where Groot and Rocket are kind of eventually spotting Peter, and they're like, yeah, we want to collect that bounty. We have Gamora, who is also going out of her way to get Peter, because ultimately, when Ronan hears that his men have failed, ultimately pushes Ronan to call out Gamora. So Gamora eventually goes and tries to get Peter as well as Rocket does. There's a whole moment of like Peter being put through a net. There's battles popping off between all these people, and it basically ends with the Nova Corps arresting all of them. And interestingly enough, the same person that Peter takes the stone to try to figure out its value, we also have Yondu eventually finding out exactly where he took this as well, talking about little trinkets that the guy has, and that ultimately he wants to buy a bunch of them so he can display all of them on his dashboard of his ship. So we have where easily all of these people are are all like arrested. They're ending up all having to do their mug shots. Of course, Peter gives the middle finger because that's who he is. That's the big joke of this movie. Was a consistent time where like you would see like photos of him like giving the finger or kind of doing the fisherman like reel of the middle finger, which I thought was hilarious. We have where if we didn't know who any number of these people are, we have Nelson C. Riley, who ultimately plays a Nova character that is going to tell us, or John C. Riley. Why did I say no? Noah. John C. Riley, who plays a a Corpseman Day, evidently is his name in this movie. Like I heard the word day, but I couldn't connect. Uh, so we have John C. Riley that is going and talking to another character called Peter Serafinowicz, which I know that's a really hard name to pronounce, but I probably butchered it. Uh, but ultimately, I don't know when talking about the Amazon show The Tick if I mentioned this person's name or not, because I probably did not mention any of the actual actors' names in that one. So, Peter Serafinowicz, or Witzk. Man, I probably butchered that more this time. So let's we have, and he plays a supernova. So interesting enough, John and Peter are going and telling you every single thing about every one of these people. We ultimately find out that Gamora has ties with Thanos. We ultimately find out that Rocket is like a a crazily put together character, or crazily like scientist, like mad scientist invented character. And ultimately, if you probably go and play the Telltale game, you'll see like a much more like heavy story about it, as well as them quite possibly going and fighting Thanos, which eventually they do anyways in Endgame. So we we have in this movie, as I'm scrolling through actors' names and stuff like that, because more than likely trying to remember everybody, we have them all being put into prison, and the entire time, of course, Groot is saying, "I am Groot." Of course, Peter doesn't understand that. He's just kind of like, "Okay, what's up with Giving Tree here?" Like, he said this like a ton of times now. He said this like 18 times now. And ultimately, we now can. Rocket explains that basically that like Groot can't speak too good or speak too well, and so reasonably, that is the reason why his he has just he can only say very few words. So if you kind of break down and match every single one of these characters to be like a Star Wars character, Peter is kind of like Han Solo. Groot is kind of like R2D2. We have Rocket, who is just kind of like a mixture of things. We can ultimately like stubbornly like or weirdly call him like a Yoda, but not really. Um, we can ultimately have like if anything, Rocket is maybe more if Chewbacca could talk. We ultimately have like Drax, who is much more of like a Jedi. We have, of course, Gamora, who is like Leia, and so like if anything, like this is Star Wars, but so much more complicated and so much better in some aspects. It's like early Star Wars, but better. So, but not to display or not to tarnish anything that Star Wars did, but still, um, we we have here where they are kind of going through the rungs of prison. Ultimately, Peter is seeing a guardsman that is ultimately throwing on his Walkman, ultimately listening to Blue Suede, "Hooked on a Feeling," which ultimately that's a song that I really enjoyed, and I was like, oh my god, this is great that this one song, is the theme song of this movie. Um, because ultimately I really enjoyed this song and I listened to it when I was very young on a cassette. Because there was a lot of interesting like cassette music that I listened to as a kid, and then eventually I grew into just really enjoying all of it. Because eventually, after some point, you would just hear these weird songs like Cotton Eye Joe and weird stuff like that, which eventually you'll grow to love because it's interesting music. Where'd you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Where'd you come from? Where'd you go? It's a weird song, but anything. So we have we have ultimately this play around with this whole cassette thing, and then ultimately is to basically tell you that Peter's not going to get his way, but eventually he will stubbornly, because that's the thing about Peter, he is stubborn, and no one's going to tell him no. And so Peter eventually goes and gets blasted, as well as everyone else does, with some orange liquid. We ultimately have them all get their prison fatigues, and they all are very much on the prison block. Let's just say, kind of walking around, and everybody is acting all tough, and basically we have people step to Peter, and of course Rocket and Groot just go, you know what? No, like, if anything, you're not going to touch this guy. This is our booty. It's like, if anything, like, if you want to get to him, you're going to get to us. But if anything, we're going to go through you. So basically, they're establishing dominance and really telling everyone, it's like, do not F with all of us or we're going to come after you, which, because they know how valuable Peter, like both Rocket and Groot realize how valuable Peter is, and because that's still their bounty, because they know that they're going to break out of prison. Because ultimately, Rocket has been known to break out of every single prison no matter what. So they're ultimately compiling a plan eventually, but we get to see how when Gamora is put into this prison, like, how, of course, she always is a strong person, but when she gets to this prison, like, we start to see how maybe afraid she actually is. And she always puts up a front because she has to. I thought that was beautiful. I thought the scaring prison moment where ultimately Gamora finally like cracks a little bit, like, that was so interesting to ultimately see that we get Peter and like, we get to see Peter kind of just go into like trying to justify how every person of his team is valuable. But like, I'm kind of curious, the like, where in truly Peter's head was at. Was Peter just like at first sight just infatuated with Gamora? Was Peter just like basically saying that like basically trying to say the real reason why he was trying to see some value in Gamora is because like there was something beyond, like there was something about her that at some point in time might have just been a like he knows her, like he knows something about her, and like maybe she is a person just putting up a front, and maybe he's so concerned about how like people will get to her. So because we have it to where there's a they there's a ton of prison men that ultimately take Gamora, and pretty much everybody is completely fine with it. You even have a guardsman who is basically saying it's like, yeah, take her to this section because ultimately like it'll be easier to clean up all the blood. So when they first all arrive in prison and they kind of like they transition, we have it to where Drax is ultimately just watching from far away, which I think is the greatest way to introduce this character. Like basically as a person that when you first show him, he doesn't say a thing. He doesn't say a thing and then until ultimately he has to. So some of the prison men are eventually going and attacking or going to kill and slay Gamora. And of course, Drax goes into and prevents this. Like I think at some point he also did that in Bushwick, to where ultimately when Brittany Snow's character was getting attacked, Dave rushes in and very much tries to diffuse all of that. Like again, we get that same point here where Dave comes in and diffuses this situation because he wants, like, he knows her value because ultimately he knows that she is going to get him to Ronan, and that is the thing that he wants. But then at the end of the movie, you see that he also has another game plan, which is just like, God, you're exhausting. You're exhausting, Drex, but you're great. Um, but anyways, so we have we have it to where Dave is ultimately like telling these prison members that ultimately like, hey, don't kill Gamora because I want to kill Gamora. But again, he still has a game plan. He still is stealing people's knives because he likes them, and of course, like he's like, I like your knife. I'm taking it. And the prison guard's like, and the prisoner's like that was my favorite knife. So we have Peter that, funny enough, like we have Dave come in to defuse this, but then like we also have Peter that is also going to defuse this. So man, we got a lot of diffusing situations going on right now. Like funny enough, like we like everybody is like coming in and like showcasing us how much value Gamora has, which I think is the greatest thing. So because ultimately if we didn't like showcase these people enough or make them strong enough for that weak moment that Gamora had where she broke a little bit in the prison cell, we are now reconfirming why Gamora is as strong as she is, which is great because like hey, she's a strong character because she's really valuable because Gamora ends up um, like consistently like killing some of the prison members or stabbing some of them. And so we have Peter come in, diffusing the situation, ultimately doing, of course, the cut of the throat thing, and and of course Drax with his like the Source like delivery or his Jedi like delivery. Basically, he's like, "Why would I put a finger on his throat?" Because ultimately he's talking about Ronan. Because ultimately Peter is talking about, hey, like this girl will give you Ronan. Like if anything, like give us time to try to escape because Rocket already has a plan. And so give us time to break out of this whole prison, and then ultimately you can have her live because she can sell an orb that I have, and she can also give you Ronan and everything. So ultimately, Drax goes along with this. Ultimately, now we have to eventually get into the escape plan that Peter knows Rocket already has, and so. And plus, we're also like mentioning like how much money everyone's gonna get from all of this, from all these deals. Because ultimately, Rocket is mentioning like how much of a portion he's gonna get, and then ultimately Groot walks in. It's like, okay, okay, so now like you like Groot missed all the action, but like as soon as anyone's talking about a deal to be made, then he pops his head up. So we have now where they're coming up with this plan, this masterfully craftable plan, where ultimately Rocket is mentioning about the stuff that he needs. He's mentioning that he wants to get uh, like a prosthetic leg that Peter has to now go get. And basically he has to, like, Gamora has to get a hand bracelet-ish like thing, a giant like bracelet thing that one of the guards have that ultimately can control like it's a computer-ish like thing. We have it to where ultimately Rocket is also mentioning some gadget that is on top of one of the prison things, and Groot just goes all the way out and grabs it. And so like basically like they were trying to figure out exactly when to start this whole breakout, and then Rocket grabs the first thing that they need, and so Rocket's like, well, I guess we're just gonna do this right now. And so everybody starts to scramble. Gamora breaks the arm of the guard to where this gadget that the guard has comes off of him. We have Peter, who is desperately trying to get this prosthetic arm or this prosthetic leg, and like we find out later, he had to transfer this guy like 30,000 credits. So we have them all scrambling to eventually get onto this little like outpost thing within this it's like a little outpost thing where it has all like the security cameras and it has all the technology or whatever, but this little outpost thing in this prison like separates itself, and then eventually we get it to where like all the guards are just surrounding this little outpost device as it's starting to float up. But then eventually we realize that the gravity in there is also just floating up as well. before that we had Peter trying to climb up with this prosthetic leg in his neck, and we had Drax going like, "Hey, man who slept with a Valerian or whatever he ends up calling. Dude, I did that one time." Like, because ultimately we had Peter mentioning to Drax like all like the different kind of species of women that he slept with, and all the injuries that he's had because of it, and ultimately like telling Drax that like, hey, don't like take this woman lightly because she'll crush you, she'll kill you. So we have to where they're all in this outpost, all the gravity is being put out of this thing, and eventually they are mad scrambling to figure out a way out of this prison, to ultimately get like onto almost being put outer space, but really when looking at it, they're gonna go and get their clothes, they're gonna go and get the orb, they're gonna go and ultimately have Peter uh, eventually fly out to get to the Milano, because Peter has to go back to the guard that still has his Walkman, they're still listening to Blue Suede. So while all the other characters are all making their way to the Milano, get to Peter, Peter is selfishly decking a bunch of guards to get to his Walkman, because that's all that matters to him, because that was the last thing that thing was very important to to uh to Peter's mother, that she would consistently give him mixtapes. So we have Peter making his way back to the Milano, and Drax like saying how amazing Peter is, and that basically he's like, "Man, you're going to be a vital member of our battle against Ronan, and like, what was this important thing that you had to go back for?" And Peter just hands him off the Walkman, and Drax goes, "God, you're an imbecile." Just the delivery of all of this moment, like for Dave, like everything is always just like so spotless, and so just the delivery of this character, like especially when they're even in that little outpost thing, where ultimately like Peter calls Drax a human thesaurus, and like Rocket has to explain why like metaphors won't work for Drax because they'll just go over his head. And and Drax of course goes, "Nothing will go over my head. Like my reflexes are too fast. I will catch it." It's like just the Jedi of all of it, but also um the huge confidence that Drax always has, but also the just like this man will not be stopped. When he has a goal in mind, like this, like Dave is always Dave as well as Drax is always that like unstoppable force. He will keep coming at everybody, and that's what I always like admired about him. So we have to where now we are in this spaceship, ultimately having the master plan to go to nowhere. to have them kind of just have a little fun, just kind of go into the collector to see how valuable this thing really is, and to ultimately have them finally tell us that this thing that Peter is just playing around with, treating like a baseball and dropping at points in time, is a Infinity Stone. And basically, like, funny enough, we have these moments where, like, Del Toro's character is like doing these like jazz hand like gestures, and ultimately have it to a rocket is going to mimic that, which I found hilarious. So we have it to where Del Toro is mentioning like the Infinity Stones to like let us know eventually where this story is eventually going to head. Like basically telling us how like one stone is like a world ender like thing. And how some people would try to grab onto this and hold on to this to see if they were powerful enough, and it destroyed all of them. So we have it to where the collector's his one of his women grabs this stone and ultimately mentions that I will not be your slave anymore. And as she's grabbing this stone, you can see her slowly but surely rip apart and scream as she is confettiing away. And basically, like, people are running out of this building because it's going to explode. And Rocket, of course, this is where we mentioned where it's like, where Rocket yells to Peter, it's like, dude, you've been having that in your purse? And and Peter mentions, it's a satchel. Funny enough, yeah, when they get to nowhere, like they have to mention about the outlaws, and like basically like that the Guardians, when they come to nowhere, they might be outlaws. It's like, well, Peter knows a lot about outlaws, Bonnie and Clyde, Billy and the Kid, John Stamos. So we have to where, while this is all going on, we have it to where Drax, after like the whole game that they were playing, like they were like taking bets, and ultimately like Drax and Rocket were having fun, but then eventually Drax like yells at Rocket, and then Rocket eventually like mentions how much crap Drax had given him, and like it was the wrong thing that Drax had said. And so we have to where Drax ultimately, because he could not fight Rocket, so ultimately he wants to like, his head's boiling, he wants to fight Ronan, so ultimately he calls him there to nowhere to ultimately get the battle he wants, because unstoppable force. So interestingly enough, when Ronan arrives here, like, of course, the first thing that Dave does is like barrel in, just like, and just goes after him, goes after Ronan, and like, Lee Pace is like just strong arming like Dave within this film. But like when looking at it, like there's a reason for that. There's like Ronan is just overpowering everyone in this film, and so reasonably it's just like, well, like it's an intimidation factor that no matter what, this guy is gonna take out everyone, and I mean everyone once he gets close enough to them. Hence why you never really see Lee Pace battle anybody that much within this movie because he would just crush everyone. So we have Ronan show up himself ultimately to take down Drax, and Drax mentions how he wants to seek vengeance for his family and for himself, and Ronan doesn't even know, like, I don't even know what you're talking about. like even if I would care to even know anything about you. So to Ronan, everything is just a bug to be crushed. Like he basically doesn't want to learn anyone's name. He doesn't want to he even is threatening Thanos, and basically he assumes that Thanos isn't even a match for him. Interestingly enough, it would be actually interesting to see a Infinity Stoned Ronan against Thanos. That would have been an interesting match to see, Ronan at some point in time actually fighting Thanos at all. I thought that would be kind of like, here's where you could really showcase how powerful Ronan really is. If at some point, if Thanos kind of swatted him away, or ultimately they seemed very equally matched, to ultimately set us up for Thanos. But again, with Thanos, they didn't want to they still at this point in time didn't want to give you a ton of showcasing of Thanos. So we have Lee Pace, who is ultimately going to sway all these people and get them all to want to fight. We have it to where there is consistent portions of all these characters going into ships, battling out in space, and reasonably the ships that they all have aren't they're construction ships that the Guardians are in. They're trying to desperately figure out how to battle Ronan's ships, but basically these they have to be very creative to figure out how to take down every single one of these ships. They have to tear into tear into one of Ronan's ships to control the ship and destroy them. Basically there's a ton of times where they have to adjust and crazily figure out how to do everything with these ships. But these construction ships that every single one of the Guardians are in, they can't go very long into outside Nowhere's atmosphere. Basically, Rocket is basically telling how weak these ships are to Peter. Because ultimately, when Gamora's ship ends up getting taken down, Peter goes out of his own ship into his Star-Lord mask and tries to get her. And of course, Peter goes into sacrificing himself to give her his mask. And so then Peter starts to die, and die quickly. having Rocket like basically telling him all this. It's like two people won't fit in your ship. If anything, like you're going to die. You're going to die in seconds. Because ultimately, when Peter gets out of his ship, he calls out to Yondu to tell him like, "Hey, come and get me. Like, here's exactly where I am. Come and get me." Because Yondu's ships Yondu's ship is an actual much more substantial ship that could take out Ronan. And basically, Peter needs to talk to Yondu to work with him anyways. So we have it to where Gamora and Peter end up getting sucked into the Ravager ship. We have it to where Rocket goes back to the surface to talk to Groot and Drax about what is their next plan, and because ultimately, like, they are ragging on Drax about the thing that he did on Nowhere, and Drax was desperate for vengeance, and of course Rocket is like, boo hoo, so you've lost people, so you've lost everyone, boo hoo for and like, and Groot is just like mortified. He's like, how could you say that? and Rocket's just like, I don't care. Everybody's lost everything. That's the whole point of this story, is that every single one of these characters have all lost everything, and eventually to put them all back together and team them up or just to put them all together, all pirates all together, basically is to, like, these are all people that have nothing, so they're just all on an island of misfit toys, which of course is a Rudolph reference. That reasonably they fit so well because they are misfit toys, and so smash them all together and just do that. So we have to where Peter is having a shouting match with Yondu, and again we throw out that Rooker that that Yondu is mentioning, that's like, hey, you know, my people could have could have eaten you. It's like, why mention this? Why mention this again? But that's the thing. That's the trope. That's the funny bit. And we turn this back around to where Peter is like, you know how many times I've heard you say that? It's like who would just stubbornly just love to just eat people and this and that. So we have it to where Chris is mentioning, it's like, hey, how about we go to Nova, and we go to Nova with this Infinity Stone, because we desperately need to like have one big huge battle out, because Ronan, or what happened is that eventually Ronan had gotten the Infinity Stone, and so now we have to get this back from him, and because ultimately, like, Ronan had basically put his put this stone into his axe, and now he's like uberly powerful. So we we have we have to where like because Ronan is coming to Nova to take down the the Nova planet, the planet of Nova. So because what is happening is I'm I'm trying to get all the details right because things are starting to scramble a little bit um, for exactly everything. So we have Ronan, who eventually gets the stone, eventually powers himself up, and then eventually goes and mentions that like he's gonna go on his own way instead of like having Thanos and having Thanos tell him to do everything. So Ronan goes and is going to Nova. So Peter is telling people from Peter is telling the people from Nova, hey, Ronan's coming and he's coming with an Infinity Stone. Like, hey man, like if anything, yeah, I've been like I've been crappy to you. But like when looking at it, yeah, I've been crappy, but I'm not a 100% dick. And so we have it to where there's some people that are at Nova. We have John C. Riley's character getting this message, and people are starting to and ha whether or not Peter is absolutely talking everything right about all this. And so reasonably, we have to where they are scrambling all the Ravengers. Ultimately, Nova Corps is eventually going to come to Peter's avail because when looking at it, like Ronan is going to unleash all of his ships. There's a big, huge battle going all out, and funny enough, we have the supernova, the Peter, the guy from the Tick that I mentioned. Like basically he was not wanting to believe anything that Peter says, but he's gonna go with this anyways because Day is. John C. Riley's character is. So what ends up happening is that they are stopping any way possible for getting Ronan to land on this planet. So Ronan is coming to Nova, and they are like taking every single one of the Nova ships, connecting all of them to stop Ronan's ship from getting to the surface. And basically, like, Ronan's ship is trying so hard that it crushes some of the Nova Corps, but then also Ronan also goes far offside to his ship to mention to all these Nova people, it's like like I'm gonna take all of you out with the tender of which that you will all burn, and puts his staff outside of his ship to just fizzle out all of these Nova Edge like characters. They're all buckling. Peter, who's a supernova, shouts out Rocket, and oh, Peter's name in this movie was Sal. There we go. I'm like, I know it's Sal because Rocket shouts out, "Hang on, Sal!" But too late. So we have we have Ronan, who is going to make it onto this surface regardless. Basically, Yondu is taken down. He's sending a message to Peter saying, "Hey man, like my ship's going down. No more games." So basically, like everybody's going down. Everyone's getting defeated. All their ships are just like we have Nebula who um crashes onto Milano. Everybody's getting taken out. So we have it to where Ronan hits on the surface of the planet. So everybody's starting to gather around. Ronan is like just loving to want to do his speech. There's so much carnage around. There's so much destruction. So Ronan's getting ready to basically give them this one big speech before he kills them all, kill everyone. And all while there's a song playing in the background, someday things are going to get easier. So Chris Pratt eventually. Because here's the thing. We have. And here's the thing that I completely skipped on. Because there is this big, giant weapon that they take out Ronan with when eventually he gets the stone. That also is a big, giant weapon that Rocket threatens the Ravengers with when ultimately they know full well that both both uh, both Gamora and Peter are on the Ravager ship. So we have to where yeah, because on Nowhere, what ends up happening is like they end up like fighting out, or they end up having to fight out every single one of these like people on Ronan's ship, and they ultimately like kill Karath, and they freaking deck people all around the ship, but Ronan still gets the Infinity Stone anyways. So and we have it to her at that moment, that beautiful like light moment of seemingly like Firefly like moment. Where ultimately Drax talks about like like loving every single one of his like members, even though he'll still treat Gamora like crap. But then eventually Nebula treats Gamora like crap, and Drax shoots her because yeah. So mad scramble of all of this stuff. Just mad scramble me talking about all this. But getting back, because there's always a points in time when I have to like tailor back some portion of movie that I forgot. And because ultimately, like, we're almost getting to the end anyways. So, Ronan gets the Infinity Stone and is now on the planet and is now just like, I'm going to take everybody down. But like Rocket has like this easy way of quickly inventing everything and creating a bomb and creating a weapon that is just gonna take out everyone. So we have Peter who's dancing it out and ultimately just calling out like that calling out Drax for a dance off, or calling out Drax. Well, he's kind of like pivoting to people, but he's calling Ronan for a dance off. Why am I saying Drax? Ultimately he's pivoting it like ultimately Peter is dancing it out. He's pivoting it to Gamora, where Gamora's like no, and like Peter ultimately like takes it back. Kind of regaling back to the moment where Peter and Gamora are at nowhere, where they're listening to Gamora's listening to his headphones, to where Chris Pratt is talking about Footloose, how it's like what great hero Kevin Bacon was, to where when they're battling it out in that big huge brawl, like Gamora's like, man, this is like Kevin Bacon. It's Kevin Bacon, Footloose. So we have it to where Peter is dancing to do a distraction. And so reasonably what is going to happen is, instead of hitting Ronan for the second time with this big huge weapon that they used to try to defeat him before, and Drax was like, oh my god, you did it, but then Ronan gets right back up and it's like, oh crap. So we have to where, instead of hitting Ronan, they hit his axe, and the axe splinters away, and ultimately now Ronan and Peter are both jockeying for this stone. Peter ends up grabbing it, and so eventually here's this amazing moment where ultimately, seeing before, where people would grab the stone and everything would start to be torn away, and some people would even combust when holding this stone. When Peter is holding on to it, he is Wolverine-esque, like starting to confetti away, but then eventually like having a healing factor to bring it all back. To where eventually Gamora is grabbing onto him, to eventually to where Drax is grabbing onto him, and so on and so forth, because Groot is no longer there, because Groot had to cocoon Peter, Drax, Gamora, and ultimately die to protect them within Ronan's ship once it crashes. So we have it to where Peter takes the stone and holds it out to blast out Ronan, killing him. And then everyone else is like, yay, woohoo! Like they won. Peter ends up putting the stone back into some safe little nugget, and little safe little ball-ish like thing. And Yondu is like, well, hey, I want that. Give me that. And so Peter gives him that, but it's not the right one. So Yondu goes off because he got what he came for, going off to a ship, realizing later that the thing in this ball is not the stone, it's a troll instead. And like Peter, Yondu can appreciate the underhanded things that Peter does, and this and that, because just like he's gonna keep coming after him. Ultimately, we have Peter, who gives the stone to the Nova Corps, and basically tells them, it's like, hey, like this is like this is all great that we won, woohoo! Yeah, but we lost so many people. But like the Nova Corps is like mentioning to like all these people, it's like, man, this is like amazing that they came for us. This is amazing that they fought this out with us and tried their best. And weirdly, like Glenn Close is mentioning, it's like yeah, there must be some like ancestry like in you because we checked your blood, and there's must be some ancient thing about you to hold on to this stone for so long. So we have it to where like John C. Riley is mentioning once he's showcasing that they rebuilt the Milano. It's like, hey, like you saved me, you saved my family. Like I can go home to my family, and they showcase that he does. It's like, thank you for all this. It's like, for all that you've done, we're gonna expunge every single one of your crimes, and like you're all free to go. But every single one of them are all just like, well, yeah, but what if I take from somebody because I want it more, like Rocket says that. And it's like, well, that's stealing and that's a crime. And then like Drax is like, well, what if I get into disagreement with somebody and pop out their spine? Like John C. Riley is just like, well, that's murder and that's the worst crime ever. Just awesome. Just everything like that moment is like hilarious. It's always funny. I love that part. So we have holy crap, I've been talking for an hour and a half. So let's kind of conclude this. So we have Peter who eventually they fly off. They fly off. It's the end, the flying off moment to where they're going into their next plan, their next this, the next that. So that's how I'm going to conclude all this because I didn't realize I was spending an hour and a half talking about this. Holy crap. I'm going to get out of here because I think the movie is like an hour and 40 some odd minutes. I didn't realize I'm going to take that long. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.